Hello, everyone. Lisette here. Today, I wanted to talk with you about thriving in the future of this new flexible work. Many of you know me from my book, Work Together Anywhere. And as many of you know, I have never tried to argue whether remote is better than in person because it just depends on the company and the circumstance. However, what I have always said was that regardless of how we work, we want to set up our systems and processes so that we can work remotely if the situation arises. In the past, I would use examples like sick children or bad weather. I never would have thought of a global pandemic. Nobody would have taken me seriously. But here we are, and we're 4 years later. And you would think that we would all be location independent by now. But indeed, the opposite is true. Return to office mandates are rising. Leaders say that productivity is down, that people are disappearing, and that the company culture is suffering. And indeed, I have an example in my life. My friend Abe was hired years ago to be an all remote team and just recently has been mandated back to the office. And this is from their company handbook. He says to have meaningful collaboration and promote creativity and spontaneity, we need to have people back at the office at least 1 day per week. Our objective is about effective collaboration, building connection, and harnessing serendipitous interactions. And indeed, what we're seeing is when you pull people across the globe, we see that about 50% of us want to be hybrid at about 2 or 3 days in the office. 30% of us want to be fully remote, and 20% of us want to return to full time in person. And what we're seeing is that people don't mind going back to the office if there's a good reason. And the number one deterrent seems to be the commute. Everybody disliked the commute before the pandemic, and now it just seems insane, right? And the second reason is that sometimes it doesn't make sense. This is Abe, and he has been mandated back to the office where he sits amongst rows and rows of empty desks at a workstation inferior to the one that he has in home, and he's on Zoom calls all day. So, indeed, mandates might be necessary, but we want to mandate what makes sense. So, what we know is that the future of work is flexible. We can't go back to the way that it used to be because one, people don't want to go back to the way that it was before. And two, the way that the world is working has fundamentally changed. Now, it turns out that we can't all just do what we want because when everybody does that, there's chaos. And so the future of work is both flexible and deliberate. What we know is that teams that collaborate intentionally are the ones that have superpowers, regardless of where you are. And so if you are being mandated back to the office, I hope that this presentation will give you some tips for how you can create and plan for the inevitable flexibility that is coming your way. And for those of you who are already free to choose where you want to work, I hope that this presentation gives you some tips for how to work in a more sustainable and fun way so that if you do have to go back to the office, that you don't go backwards in time. Now, to start the conversation around this, I would like to take us back in time to the 1970s and to take a tour of how offices have changed throughout the decades. In the 1970s, the open office plan was the most popular setup, and you can see that the furniture was modular so that it could be moved around according to the project. And we would tell people where we were on these calendars that were hanging on the wall. So when you went out to lunch, you would move your thing to go out to lunch, and so people could visually see what was going on. Now we get to the 1980s and we've got the punch card. So you punch in and you punch out and you're paid exactly for the minutes that you've worked. And we see the rise of the cubicle. So you can see that we've got these cubicle offices. And if you were really lucky, you got a cubicle with high walls to give you some semblance of feeling like you had privacy. And just to prove that I was there, this is me in the 90s in my cubicle. I worked for an engineering firm. And what I remember about that time was that there was a person whose job was to route all the incoming calls to the company to the individual desks where people were sitting. This was pre-cell phone days, right? And so that was their primary job. And in those days, we would have these interdepartmental mail folders where the most important messages that you wanted to get out to people, you would print, put in one of these envelopes, sign your name when you had read it, and then pass it on to somebody else, either in the hall or in one of these mail boxes that we had at the office. In the 2000s, the open office plan starts to make a comeback again. And in fact, to this day, about 80% of offices in the US are open office plans. In 2010, when the tech starts to make a splash, we start to get the Twitters and the Facebooks, our offices become more colorful to try to entice sort of the younger generation to our new hip workspaces. And then in 2020, we have the great remote work experiment with the pandemic. And we find that the companies that had remote work processes in place had a truly seamless transition to this new way of working. And we also learned that working at home during a pandemic is not the same thing as proper remote work. So now we're in this in-between stage where we're moving from this mindset of being office first, where the office was the primary place that we went to get our work done. And we're moving now towards a more flexible first way of working, where the office becomes one of many places that we go to get our work done. And if you even look towards modern organizational design thinkers like Jürgen Appelow, he says, if you want an organizational structure that can handle the challenges of the 21st century, then you need to ensure that there's practically no difference between a physical team and a virtual team. So here we are. And what I thought we would do is go through each of the things that leaders were concerned about that were causing the return to office mandates and address how we might be able to talk about these things. So we'll start with productivity, and then we'll address people are disappearing, and we'll end with culture is suffering. So productivity is down. At least that's what leaders are feeling and saying right now. And it turns out that work-life balance looks different for everybody. Everybody has their own image of what your ideal day looks like, right? And during the pandemic, we really got to experiment with some of the things that made us happy. And so, for example, my ideal day is when my neighbor cat Hugo comes over every morning for a cup of coffee, and then we go on a short walk together. I come back to my office. I do a few hours of focused work. In the afternoon, my husband and I go swimming or running or biking, just depending on the weather. And then I come back, do a few more hours of focused work, and then I have the evenings free for myself or my friends and family. That's my ideal day. But I would love to know from you, what does your ideal day look like? Why don't you just put a brief outline in the chat, and we can get an idea of all the similarities and differences that we have amongst each other here on this call. So while you're all putting this in the chat, I'll keep going ahead. And one of the things that we know is that work-life balance looks different for everyone, as I said. Now, it turns out that there's sort of two types of people. One type are the splitters, where we have work and then we have life. And then there are the blenders. That's me. I'm a blender. And so, I do a little life and then I do a little work, and then I do a little life and then I do a little work. I sort of blend throughout the day until the evenings. So what I'd like to ask from this audience is, are you a splitter or a blender? So I've got a Mentimeter that you can go to, and why don't we go ahead and put in if you're a splitter or blender. And just to let you know before I show the results, it's usually 50-50 in every audience. So we'll see what we have today. All right, so these are the results. It turns out here we've got about a 60-40 split, just about, from splitters and blenders. So of course it depends on circumstances, and the way, sometimes you want to blend, but you have to split, all kinds of things. But in general, this is what it looks like. So the point is that work-life balance looks different for everybody. And one of the new techniques, the new things that's become popular since the pandemic, is people creating personal user manuals. It starts as an introspective exercise to understand what is it that we need in order to feel productive. And then it expands into helping your team understand what is it that they need to know about you in order to work best with you. So this is my personal user manual. I've got mine on my website. You can check that out. And in mine, I've just got normal things like my languages that I speak, my ideal working hours, my communication preferences, some of my quirks. Like for instance, I'm a really slow writer. So when you ask me to do things, it takes me a long time. So it's good for me to know, right? So I take the time, and it's good for you to know so that we leave enough time for it. And then I've got also some of my hobbies and values and things that I like. Now, I have this picture of Depeche Mode here because my father-in-law, whom I've known for 15 years now, took a look at my personal user manual last year and saw that I was a fan of Depeche Mode. Now, I didn't know that he was a music fan. We have very little overlap in conversation. He's more of a football guy, and I'm a sewing person. So when we discovered Depeche Mode, we became Depeche Mode buddies, and we have all kinds of music things to talk about now. So that was one power of the personal user manual, right? Is to create connections that we might not normally know about somebody when we're working with them. Now, this is Daya's personal user manual. She uses Notion for hers, and she is a coach and works with a variety of different teams. And so she uses her personal user manual during the interview process and during the onboarding process. So those are two really great, fast ways for people to get to know her when they start to work together. So there's no one right way to create a personal user manual. However, one of the things that we know is it's good to get clear. And managers and leaders have always been afraid that people would be lazy when we allow them to work remote. However, the opposite was true. And that was defined throughout the pandemic, that burnout was far more of a problem than laziness. And even just last month, the Financial Times published that work from home was associated with higher productivity, about $20,000 yearly for each extra remote day a week. So leaders might feel that productivity is down. However, the data is not showing that to be true. Let's talk about people are disappearing. When we work together in an office, then we can see what's going on and we have sort of a general understanding about what's happening. When we work hybrid or remotely, we have to create transparency in new ways. Part of group cohesion is knowing what other people are doing. And one of the ways that we can create transparency is by working out loud and making our work visible to others in a way that's useful for them, right? We don't want to just spam people with what we're doing all day, but we want to create ways in working that make how we're working visible to everybody on the team in a way that's useful. Ryan from X Team says people respect you more when they know how you contribute, and they question your value when they don't know how you contribute. So not only does working out loud create more transparency, but it also helps people to value each other more, right? Because we know what people are doing and we know that we fit in to the bigger picture. Now, there's also some creative ways of recreating and redefining presence. And one of those ways is through virtual offices. Now, we're all used to a physical headquarters, but some teams are now experimenting with virtual headquarters. And so these virtual offices you can go to through your browser or an app, and each one of these individual boxes represents a room. These avatars here represent people in the room. And if I'm in the lounge, which the four of us are, we're discovering that we're cat people. And if I wanted to go into another room, I would just double click on that room and I'm in that room with those people. So these kind of tools help people feel a little bit more close to each other and present. Plus you can see where everybody is on the virtual map. And so if I want to just go ask someone a question, I'll virtually knock on their door. Now, I run virtual co-working sessions almost weekly, and this is just groups of people getting together and doing work, needing a little accountability to have people around them. So you're welcome to join those sessions anytime just to see how something like that might work. And then there are companies who are experimenting with telepresence. Now, telepresence robots like these, they're drivable, so you can beam in just like we're doing on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, except for you can drive yourself using the arrow keys on your keyboard. So at the Suitable Technologies office, they've got 50% of their workforce in the flesh and 50% who have beamed in. And this is just how they normally work throughout the day. And then, of course, there's virtual reality, right? So, virtual reality is something that you're hearing more and more about with the metaverse and the Oculus and the Vision. And so, but these tools exist and people are experimenting with them. And really, within minutes, you could put on your Oculus Quest and be in a virtual reality room floating above space with your office mates, a truly unique experience. And I really believe that the teams that master this kind of technology are the ones that will have superpowers in the future. But really, it's all about intentionality, right? The tools make things handy and create new dynamics. But the idea is that teams that collaborate intentionally are the ones that have superpowers. And so, a more down to earth way of creating intentionality is just by outlining what is normal behavior for our team, right? What are the ways that we work together? What are the expected response times? Are there any naming things that we need to know about with the files? Are there security protocols that we have to pay attention to? Are there core hours in which we need to interact with each other, right? So my team has sat down and we've created this team agreement canvas, and we've just talked very generally about what are the values for the team. That's what drives our behavior. What information are we going to share and how are we going to share it? How are we going to communicate and what tools and what are the expected response times? That was a big thing on my team. And then collaboration, how do we know what each other are doing and what do we need to know? And then since the pandemic, we've added this column here, this row of well-being, just to ask ourselves, how do we work in a sustainable way so that we don't burn out? What are the things that we need to put in place as a team? So we've put this all together on a canvas. Everybody added their opinions and what they thought, and then all the things that we agreed on, we added to our team agreement document. And then at the bottom, we've got here things that we don't agree on. So we also had some things that we didn't agree on, and we wanted to add those to the document as well, just to make things a little bit more explicit. Again, what we're trying to do here is create transparency into group behavior and sort of protocols. Now, it doesn't have to be complicated. This is Adriana's team's team agreement, and they just use the Miro board, and they've outlined how they're going to work together using this Miro board. And then Allie Green, her team are digital nomads. And so their team agreement is that they meet every week to talk about how they're going to work together for that week, right? So I'd like to ask this audience here, which of these statements are true? I'd like to see how many people here have a personal user manual or not, and how many people here have a team agreement or not. So go ahead and go over to Mentimeter, and it turns out here that almost all of us don't have a personal user manual, and some of us have a team agreement, but still not a lot of us. So that is an interesting number here, something to think about. In the super kit, for the link that you've been seeing, I have got all of the resources, personal user manual manuals, team agreement facilitator guides, where you can download all of that for free on that super kit link that you've been seeing. All right, so now the other thing that team agreements help us with is the phenomenon of information overload. A couple of years ago, a study came out where they found that the number of work applications sending us notifications at any given time was around 6 or 7, depending on where you are in the world. And that most of us are replying to these notifications outside of our own designated working hours, not the ones designated by other people. And many of us are finding it difficult to switch off because, one, we're preoccupied about thinking about what we need to do because we're getting all these notifications, right? And in fact, most of us are signaling to our colleagues that we're online and working by sending messages to each other. The statistics show that we check our inboxes about once per minute, and our instant messaging systems our inboxes once every 6 minutes, and our instant messaging systems about once per minute, right? And so we're just constantly in this back and forth. The problem is that most of us are knowledge workers, and we need time for deep, focused, concentrated work. And this constant back and forth is not giving us the focused time that we need. And in fact, Cal Newport, author of Deep Work and A World Without Email, has coined this phenomenon as the hyperactive hive mind. So it's a form of collaborating that's just made possible by these messaging systems that have developed. And the idea is that we're really getting this information overload. And so the way to tame the hyperactive hive mind is by changing how the work flows through the organization so there's less need for this useless chatter going back and forth. Some of it's useful, some of it's really not, right? And could be better, could be eliminated with just better organization. So what he says is, instead of trying to keep up, which is impossible anyways, we need to change how we work. So one example of a team who has done this was a small team with a large number of projects, and they were constantly in this hyperactive hive mind behavior. They got themselves a Trello board, put all the projects on that dashboard, and now anytime anybody had a question about it, they just had to check the dashboard and it was updated in real time, right? So that takes out a lot of unnecessary messages and meetings. So we want to just change how the work is flowing. Now, there are lots of tools for this. And one of the things that remote and hybrid teams are encouraged to do is to create more visualizations with each other. IOBEA is one of those tools that allows each team to sort of create their own to-do board, and each board is connected. So you could get a bird's eye view or zoom in individually on what's going on at any given time. Right. So these kind of tools help us to create more transparency into how work is flowing. Last year, I had the opportunity of interviewing astronaut Paul Richards. And when I asked him what are some of the techniques that he brought from working in space remotely back down to Earth to his teams here, is he said that what astronauts try and do is they train to have the right information at the right place at the right time. And so that's exactly what remote and hybrid teams need to do here, right? Excuse me, in order to work intentionally, we need to have the right information at the right place at the right time. That is how we create superpowers amongst us. Again, teams that collaborate intentionally. All right, so I want to just stop here and see if there are any questions from our audience. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and move on. And again, if you want to download the free super kit, it's got a lot of remote working resources there for you. All right, let's move on. We want to end with culture is suffering, and what can we do about that? And we do hear that a lot, right? People are saying that they feel less connected to the company and they feel like there's less belonging on the team. One of my favorite quotes comes from Chase Warrington, who is the head of remote at Doist. And first thing before I say the quote, excuse me again, I want to just mention that this head of remote is a new role that has been appearing as companies move more virtual. Back in the old days, we used to have office managers who would make sure that the office supplies were always full and that birthdays were remembered and maybe that things were organized, things were taken care of around the office. People now are hiring for remote office managers or head of remote to try to just keep the ties between team members or even the remote work policies more clear amongst colleagues. In any case, Chase says that team culture is primarily built by how you work together, not how you socialize together. So all the focus on pizza parties and quiz nights and feeling like, why aren't we coming together? There's a misplacement on what's important. What's important is how we work together, not how we socialize together. That's not to say that we don't want to have the pizza parties, but it doesn't determine how well we're going to work together. And what really does is understanding why people come to work to begin with, right? For some people, it's all about solving challenging problems. And for others, like myself, it's more about who we're working with than what we're working on. And for others, it's just a job. And you would motivate those three situations very differently, right? You can't motivate each of those in the same way. And so what Carlos said is you really want to understand why people come to work to begin with. And he was saying throughout the interview, my wife and I can have all the fun in the world at quiz nights and pizza parties. And he was so sweet. And he said, and we'll love each other more and more every time, but we should never hang wallpaper together. Right. So what he meant is we can have fun together, but it doesn't mean we're going to work well together. The essence comes from understanding why people are there and working well together. And in fact, I'd like to ask you, what do you need in order to feel connected on a team? Let's go ahead back into Mentimeter and just fill out what is it that you need. Now, the results are back, and what we're seeing is that trust is something that most people need, a sense of belonging, psychological safety. Noticeably, I don't see anywhere on this list money, more vacations, right? More quiz nights. So if you're trying to create more belonging and more connection, it might be important to ask your own team, what is it that you need to feel connected? And then focus your attention on this, because this is at the core. This was another team from a workshop that I did just last week. So you can see that the answers were similar: reliability, trust, laughing, and jokes. Some need face-to-face interaction. That's also important. Here's yet another workshop from several months ago. Again, transparency, common language, empathy, safety. The themes are similar throughout. So the thing that we know is that connection happens when we pay attention to each other. So what we're trying to do in this virtual world is find new ways of paying attention to each other. And one of the things that most motivates people at work, and one of the easiest things to implement, is appreciation and recognition. You'll see here in this graph that most people are motivated through recognition, and a lot of them, it matters when it comes from their manager or their leader. And in fact, back to Abe, who we talked about in the very beginning, this was an email that Abe received from one of his teammates that just said, "Hey, Abe, just wanted to send you a quick note to say thanks for all your support on this project. You've been the voice of reason several times along the way, and there have been several, thank goodness for Abe, slacks between Deb and I during this entire project." This one email not only made his day, he was so excited, he sent this to his friends who don't even work with him, right? That's just the power of appreciation. So if you're wondering where to start, it is always good to start with recognition and appreciation. In fact, one of the things that I do in my workshops is I send people a physical set of cards in the mail, right? So I've got these cards here that are fun to hold up, my Gelmo card. And so I send these in the mail. And the reason why I do it is I want to highlight how much joy and delight that there is when you get something physical in the mail, and how simple it is to do, right? So there are lots of different options for how to show appreciation. One of my favorites is you can send a pizza almost anywhere in the world. So if you find that your team is working the midnight oil or the early hours, right, maybe send a pizza for sustenance. You can, that's good for every meal, and you can send it from almost anywhere in the world. So fun things like that just adds joy and delight. And most importantly, leaders must support and role model the behaviors that they want to see. So if you are mandating people back to the office and you're not coming back yourself, people do notice and they do see it. It has an effect. So as leaders, we must role model, excuse me, what it is that we want to see. So as I mentioned before, we know that the future of work is both flexible and deliberate. We can't go back to the way that it was before, but we need to move forward in a more deliberate way. And sadly, there's no one right way. I wish there were, right? We could just follow that silver bullet formula. It depends on the company and depends on the people for what it is that they need in order to be productive, and what kind of culture do you want to have in your company. And so the idea is to experiment with what works for you. And some of the things that we know that need to change when we're flexible, first is we have to focus on autonomy, transparency, and accountability. There needs to be better documentation and information management, more frequent feedback loops, and a focus on sustainable work-life balance. And it's in everybody's interest to make it work, because we as individuals get the freedom to design our lives around the things that matter most to us. And our companies get a stronger and more connected workforce that is not dependent on location. So if you do go back to the office, please don't go backwards in time. There are things that we can do to create the future of flexible work. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for watching.